Okay, we're on.
We're on? Great, excellent. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to those of you here in Geneva at the Centre International des Conférences de Genève, and welcome to those of you joining us at the YouTube channel online. I'm David Ainsworth, the Head of Communications for the Secretariat of the Convention Biodiversity. We're very fortunate here at these resumed meetings of the convention here in Geneva to have a special guest on site today. Today we have David Boyd, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. David Boyd's been in this position since, I guess, 2018. He's originally hailing from Canada, and his work has been really fundamental in starting to outline a new element, which is that the elements of the environment, it's a sustainable development issue related specifically to human rights. Declining in the environment has an impact on the entire rights package, demonstrating that the work that we do here is cross-cutting across a variety of issues held under the UN Charter and feed under the Sustainable Development Goals. So David's going to be with us for a little bit of time today. He'll talk a little bit about the work that he's been doing, and including some of the specific issues he talks about under biodiversity. And then we'll take some questions from the media on the floor. And those of you in the YouTube channel, please put your questions in the chat, and then we'll find a way to get them off to David here right away. So David, without further ado, it's up to you. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks very much, David. And delightful to be here in Geneva, and coincidental with my report last week to the Human Rights Council on the impacts of pollution on human rights. A key part of my mandate is the relationship between human rights, healthy ecosystems, and biodiversity. And of course, this is an issue that is of great concern to Indigenous peoples and local communities who are living in close contact with nature, highly dependent on healthy biodiversity and ecosystems for their livelihoods, for their cultures, for really everything. But also to bring the critical message that we are all dependent on healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. From the food we eat that depends on pollinators, to the air we breathe that depends on plants to process oxygen, to healthy forests that can serve as a barrier to prevent the spillover of zoonotic diseases. We are all dependent, and all of our human rights are dependent on this basic foundation of healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. So in that regard, really exciting development last year at the Human Rights Council in Geneva was the recognition for the first time at the global level that everyone, everywhere, has the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. A right which includes clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, non-toxic environments, a safe climate, and healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. And so with this critical stage in the negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, it's really essential that we bring to bear this human rights-based approach to conservation and the sustainable use of biodiversity. Because if we look back over the past 30 years since the Convention on Biodiversity, when states made this solemn commitment to protect the natural foundations of life on Earth, we haven't made the progress that we set out to make. And I think that it's really critical to learn from the mistakes of the past. We've seen some really horrific human rights violations in the context of designation and creation of new national parks and protected areas, where Indigenous peoples and local communities are being evicted, oftentimes with violence and suppression of their human rights. And so what we actually have learned over the past 3 decades is really critically important, that when we empower Indigenous people, when we recognize and protect their rights to their territories, to their resources in law, we actually get a win-win situation where we advance conservation, which is beneficial to everyone, and we also advance the rights and well-being of the Indigenous peoples and local communities. And there are terrific examples from around the world where that's working. The community conservancies in Namibia are a great example. Indigenous-led national parks in Canada and Australia, where they've created these terrific new guardian programs where Indigenous people are not only involved in the designation of these parks, but also in the management and on day-to-day protection of these parks. And so I think that it's really going to be essential to include both Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights, and not only respect for those rights, but a commitment to advance the legal protection of those rights in the framework itself, and also to include everyone's right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Because at the end of the day, not only do we all depend on nature, we all have a responsibility to protect nature as well.
Okay, great. Let me go back just a little bit. So you talked about the declaration last year of, a right to a healthy environment is fundamental. What has been the impact that you've seen so far of that declaration? I know it was very, very recent, but what has already happened with that declaration in terms of advancing and other processes?
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. It's taken on a life of its own around the world. So we're seeing countries talk about adding it to their constitution, putting it in legislation, which is critical to the actual implementation of it. It's found its way into the draft outcome statement, for example, of the Commission on the Status of Women, which is focused on environment and climate change and women's and girls' rights. And we're already seeing it start to be used at a national level. There's a court decision from Costa Rica in which the Constitutional Court of Costa Rica said, look, if we're going to really implement the right to a healthy environment, we have to stop using these pesticides that are killing bees and other pollinators. In Ecuador, there's been a court case already where the right was referred to in the context of ensuring that we don't allow mining activities in protected forests. And so this right, and this is something, you know, it's, as you said, it's very recent. But if we look back at what happened the last time a right was recognized at that global level by the UN, that was in 2010, when the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council both recognized the human right to water and sanitation. And since then, we've seen it included in all kinds of constitutions in Costa Rica, Fiji, Mexico, Slovenia, Tunisia, and others. Other countries from Colombia to France have put it in legislation. And most importantly, and you know, this is really the heart of my work, most importantly, it's making a difference for people on the ground. So in Slovenia, for example, the right to water is now being delivered to Roma communities living in informal settlements. In Mexico, they've extended safe drinking water to over 1,000 rural communities. And in Canada, where I'm from, the government has taken the right to water and used it as a catalyst to deliver safe drinking water infrastructure to more than 100 remote Indigenous communities. So what I hope will happen in the same way with the UN recognition of the right to a healthy environment is it will just accelerate all of the types of really critically needed changes to improve people's well-being in terms of improved air quality, improved water quality, healthier ecosystems, a safe climate, and so forth.
Okay, great. You talked a little bit about what needed to go into this framework, because you know this framework cross-cutting all these different targets and goals, and the potential impact of this over human rights. I wonder if you could zero in on a couple of specific things, because I mean you did mention one-hand rights, so these rights could have a huge impact on IPLCs when we're looking at the question of protected areas. You know, in the framework, are there specific goals or specific targets even that you've been able to say is, you know, this approach is going to make a difference right here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I'll say is that a rights-based approach to conservation should pervade the entire framework. It should be one of the cross-cutting themes that applies in every single context. Secondly, it's really vitally important to have specific reference to the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, because that's what affects all of us, and that's what empowers all of us to engage in the conservation of biodiversity. And then the third thing I would say in terms of specific language is to have really strong language about the rights of Indigenous people and local communities, to ensure that their rights are not only protected, but actually advanced, so that in the process of advancing for example, the 30% by 2030 goal, so that we both advance that really important conservation objective, but at the same time, we advance the legal recognition of the title and tenure of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And that can bring us that can bring us win-win situations. And I believe it's the only way that we're going to effectively and equitably achieve those 2030 targets.
Right, I mean, just, you know, we had a press event just before here by a variety of Indigenous peoples and local communities as well, looking at specifically that problem that without a rights-based approach or without entrenchment of the rights, conservation things result in just terrible consequences for the different communities as well.
Yeah, and we see that on the ground right across the world. Right now there are actions taking place in Tanzania, for example, to evict Maasai people who have lived in the Ngorongoro National Park for decades and for centuries before that. And it's just such a clear violation of their human rights to kick them out of their basic homeland. And that's why it's so fundamentally important that a rights-based approach be central to conservation going forward.
Okay. So you're here at the process almost, you know, slightly by coincidence. You know, do you have, you know, plans or whatever to continue to follow? Because we'll have our COP in August. You know, is there a possibility that there'll be ways that your processes follow this moving forward?
Yeah, I had a terrific conversation with the two co-chairs of the process this morning, and we had a series of back and forth about ways we can constructively engage. And so this is definitely one of the most important priorities for me in my mandate as Special Rapporteur, and I'll be following the process closely and also working with states to try and get some of these really important rights-based language, rights-based targets into the framework.
Great. So here, I'm going to take, I'm actually going to give some space to other conventions as well. We've talked about the Biodiversity Convention, but what other agreements have you been engaging with this approach as well? I mean, biodiversity is everything, but there are other agreements out there too. Who else have you been engaging with?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, in terms of the triple global environmental crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pervasive pollution, I'm engaging with the international agreements across those three. So, in terms of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, really trying to engage with states to ensure that they take a rights-based approach to their nationally determined contributions. Really trying to use a rights-based approach to raise the level of ambition, and also to ensure that the climate finance flows in a way that respects human rights. Because right now, one of the privileges of being a special rapporteur is I do country missions. And I've done already 2 country missions to small island states, Fiji and then St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And it's really devastating to witness firsthand the impacts of the climate crisis on our fellow brothers and sisters in these countries. I mean, right now they're suffering, and so there needs to be a flow of money for climate adaptation, and also to address the elephant in the room of loss and damage. So that's in the climate context. In terms of the pollution, we're doing the same thing with the Basel Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, Stockholm and Minamata, really trying to say, look, if you take a rights-based approach, then it has this, it brings a series of benefits. One, it puts a human face on the problem. Number 2, it ensures that we really get the most full and inclusive participation possible. And number 3, it makes sure that we focus our priorities on the people who are really the furthest behind. The report that I presented to the Human Rights Council last week identified more than 50 sacrifice zones. These are some of the most polluted and contaminated places on Earth, where people's human rights are really being absolutely violated in terrible ways by toxic contamination and pollution. Those are the communities that really need us to take action to respect their human rights.
It's interesting you mentioned the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Convention. There's a side event taking place just a few hours where they're going to talk about the need for synergies between all these agreements and indeed the Biodiversity Convention. Before I open the floor for questions, I want to talk about plastics. Because as we know, we have under one of our targets of pollution, the convention will be addressing plastics for the first time with a special focus on marine areas. But the other thing too is that UNEA recently, there's this mandate to move forward on a global plastics treaty. So what should they be doing in terms of your work and this first work on the plastics treaty?
Yeah, terrific question. And so I would say the same. I'll start to sound like a broken record, but we need to take a rights-based approach to plastic, and we need to recognize that the entire life cycle of plastic, from the extraction of oil and gas, which is the primary ingredients of plastics, that activity right through the production of plastics, which is disproportionately located in poor communities of color, to the improper disposal of plastic, which disproportionately harms poor communities, in particular poor coastal communities. Again, taking a rights-based approach to ensure that we maximize our ambition, that we focus on those who are most directly affected, that's going to be a key part of it. And the reality, again, is that every single person in this room has microplastic particles in our body. The food we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink is all contaminated, and scientists don't even know what the health implications of this are. But I can tell you, it's a violation of our human rights to bodily integrity, the fact that we are, each of us, contaminated by microplastics.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how this moves forward. This is going to be an important element. I'm going to open the floor now. I know we've got a report from Zeit. Fritz, we'll open the floor for you if you want to ask questions. When I'll take a look at questions online.
Yeah, I have something I've been wondering also, following the discussion we had earlier with Indigenous groups. The question of what kind of stories we tell when we talk about loss of biodiversity and rights of people. Very often, and that includes myself as a journalist, we have negative stories, and we frame things in, the following a template of a tragedy. And I wonder if, from the field that you work on, there is also a counter-narrative possible with, Indigenous peoples are the ones that bringing forward different ways of looking at nature, and I know that you've written extensively about it, about approaches of how to view nature not just as a commodity, but as something that has rights in their own, and I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think that, if we look at the reports that have been coming out from the world's leading scientific bodies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the world's leading scientists are telling us that we don't need just band-aids to put on the problem, but we need transformative changes in pretty much all of society's systems. And I think that we can look to Indigenous people for inspiration in terms of a different vision of human well-being. Whereas in the West, we've looked at economic growth as kind of the measure par excellence of human progress. The reality is that you can dramatically increase economic GDP, the measurement, through war, through increased levels of disease and hospitalization. That's not really reflecting human well-being. Whereas if you take an Indigenous perspective of the world, the concepts that are coming out of Indigenous communities worldwide, like living in harmony with nature, and other concepts from Andean Indigenous communities about a good life, those are powerful concepts that do reflect human well-being. So I do think we do have kind of philosophical lessons to learn, and then also in terms of our relationship with the natural world. It's interesting that in Canada, First Nations have a saying called "all my relations," which reflects the fact that we don't only have human cousins and brothers and sisters, but we have connections to all of these living beings in nature. And then what's really been fascinating just in the last 30 years through the emergence of DNA testing, we actually now know that we share DNA, the basic building block of life, with every other form of life on the planet. So humans are not separate from or superior to the rest of life on Earth. We are part and parcel of life on Earth. And so that's another insight that comes from Indigenous people. And specific in the context of these narratives that you're talking about, these stories, there are some terrific stories to tell. There's stories that of Indigenous people leading conservation. So for example, on the west coast of Canada where I'm from, there's an Indigenous community called the Haida Nation. They have forcefully advocated for the protection of over half of their territory, which is now recognized by the Government of Canada. So they've protected over half of their territory and are really showing the rest of Canadians what a sustainable future looks like. Example from Africa, of Namibia, where they have very strong provisions about protecting nature in their constitution. And they've developed these community conservancies where local people are in charge of creating the protected area and then in charge of operating it, and they are also receiving the benefits of it. And so we've got this incredible scientific evidence that although hunting is still allowed in some of these community conservancies, the populations of the species that are being hunted are actually increasing because of the conservation of their habitat. And the people are benefiting economically and socially from being involved in the management of these community conservancies. So it's a win-win situation. And we've actually published a report last summer about right-based approaches to conservation, where we highlighted both examples of good practices, like the community conservancies in Namibia, a national park in Mexico that was created at the request of the local community called Cabo Pulme National Park, and where the local community has really benefited from that creation in terms of recovering fish populations and a new source of revenue through ecotourism, as well as new national parks and other types of protected areas in Canada and Australia, where Indigenous people are the ones in the lead saying, this is our territory, we want to protect it, we want to be in charge of the types of activities that take place on these lands and these waters. And so there are these really inspiring stories of Indigenous-led conservation that is proving to be both effective and equitable in terms of its outcomes. And so that's what we need to be focused on going forward, is to avoid the mistakes of the past, but also learn from the successes, and instead of replicating the mistakes, replicate the successes.
A follow-up question, so what would be from your expertise of talking to, having these high-level conversations, what is the leverage of bringing these lessons into the political realm?
I think the leverage is that, as a human society, we failed to achieve the Aichi biodiversity targets. And I think that from my vantage point, one of the most important reasons for that failure was that we didn't kind of put human rights at the heart of conservation. And if we do put human rights at the heart of conservation, as we've seen from these positive examples, that's our best chance to protect people and the planet over the next decade, over the next 30 years to 2050. That's really, if we don't put human rights at the center of conservation, we're going to end up in a world of trouble.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I think just reflecting on my own experience within this convention process, incorporating this thing is going to mean we're going to need a change in the people who come to the meetings, the way the discourse is as well. I think it's starting, but it looks like a lot more change will have to happen.
Yeah, and you've put your finger on a real problem, which is that we've been approaching these issues in silos, right?
Yeah.
So we have the human rights, that's the job of the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Environment, that's United Nations Environment Program, United Nations Environment Assembly, and these multilateral environmental negotiations are about the environment. We have to realize in the year 2022 that these issues are absolutely inextricably linked. And that's why it's so exciting to see the Human Rights Council talk about recognizing and take the step, that historic step that they took in October, of recognizing that everyone has this fundamental human right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. That's a historic breakthrough, and we need to take that breakthrough out of Geneva and bring it to these conversations. We need to bring it to the climate conversation. We need to bring it to the multilateral pollution, and just make sure that everyone understands not only that our human rights are directly jeopardized by the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and pollution, but that putting human rights at the center of the solutions is really our best way to catalyze action and accelerate progress. We've been falling behind in each of these areas over the past 3 decades, despite these multilateral environmental agreements. But when you combine human rights and these environmental agreements, you get kind of a synergistic magic happening. The enforceability mechanisms that are completely lacking in the Convention on Biodiversity, completely lacking in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, they exist in the human rights context. And so bringing those processes, those institutions, and those legally binding obligations to address the global environmental crisis is, I believe, one of the most powerful ways we can actually move forward and start to, instead of just trying to, we've been in this process and we're actually just trying to slow down the negative impacts.
Right.
We need to go forward, and a rights-based approach is, I believe, our best way to do that.
Okay. Very exciting to see that. Any more questions from anyone on the floor? One more, go ahead.
Yeah, so like you also mentioned it that there is like huge violations happening already in indigenous peoples in different parts of the world, and they already should be protected from these kinds of violations. And so what exactly do you mean by moving forward? Because they should be protected already.
Right. Yeah. So it's really a multi-step process. The first step is to stop the violations that are currently occurring. The second step is to prevent future violations, and the best way to do both of those things is to honor the rights of the people. So, one of the challenges, for example, is that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, not a legally binding, doesn't create legal obligations for states. So what we need to do is take some of these international declarations, resolutions, and turn them into legally binding law at the national and regional level. So for example, in Canada, we now have federal legislation, and in the province where I live, provincial legislation that implements the components of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And once we turn those from kind of those high-level principles into actual binding law, then we can take the steps to ensure that rights are protected, rights are honored, rights are fulfilled. So there's a really critical step between the non-binding and the turning it into law.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's true in the case of the UN resolution from last October on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It's not a legally binding or enforceable resolution. It's meant to be a catalyst for those legally binding actions at the regional and the national level. So for example, the European Convention on Human Rights is actually the only regional human rights treaty in the world that doesn't include the right to a healthy environment. But now there's a process underway through the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to create an additional protocol to the European Convention that will recognize everyone's right to a healthy environment. And that's just such a critically important stage, and I'll tell you one additional reason why. Because there have been decisions of the European Court of Human Rights in pollution cases that say, well, there are other rights that are violated by pollution. But there have been cases where people have tried to assert that the destruction of wetlands, for example, is a violation of their rights. And the European Court has said absolutely clearly, there is no right to nature preservation under the European Convention. I think they're absolutely wrong. I think they're failing to understand that the scientific evidence that our human well-being depends on healthy ecosystems, but nevertheless, that's what they've said. And so we need to have an additional protocol specifically on the right to a healthy environment that absolutely, unambiguously does include healthy nature, so that people in Europe have that fundamental legal protection.
Because there are court cases happening right now in Germany, for instance, in the US, where people are advocating for their right of living in prosperity and having a future is violated by climate change, for instance.
Right. Yes, and so we've seen like a series of successful decisions in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France, in Belgium, and that's what I was talking about earlier, about that synergy that we get when we bring environmental law together with human rights law. We get these kind of magic happening where governments are being held accountable for the first time for the commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think also they will be soon held accountable for their commitments to protect biodiversity as well. We're seeing that. I mean, I could tell you from Latin America, there are some incredible cases just over the last couple of years where, based on the right to a healthy environment, major tourism development in Mexico was blocked. In Colombia, deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, the Colombian portion, was blocked based on the right to a healthy environment. In Ecuador, mining in a protected forest was blocked. So the right to a healthy environment really has this power once it's integrated into national legal systems.
So I have a question online, actually came to me by email, because you're going to get this. So this is from Tone Smith. Tone said, she said, Tone says, business is very present in the CBD currently. What about bringing human rights thinking into economic thinking and the economy more generally? Tony wants to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that human rights needs to be a catalyst for change in the economic system as well. You know, the reality is that we live in a global economy which, because of externalities, is harmful to people and harmful to the planet. You know, the things that we buy, whether it's the clothes we're wearing, the food we eat, is based on the exploitation of labor on the one hand, and is based on damage to ecosystems on the other hand. And so we need to find ways to transform the global economy, which will require transformations in business models. And you know, among those critical societal transformations is moving away from today's, what scientists describe as today's linear economy, right? So we treat nature as just a basket of natural resources for humans to extract, make things, and then we treat nature as a garbage dump for our pollution and waste. We know that, you know, with a population of 8 billion humans, that is an utterly unsustainable system, and we need to move towards what scientists describe as a circular economy, which is really based on, you know, billions of years of natural evolution. The genius of nature is that if you make everything in such a way it can be reused, recycled, or safely composted, that's the sweet spot where we have a sustainable economy where everything just goes in a circle and we don't. But you know, to get from where we are to where we need to be is a huge challenge. And plastic, actually, I think that you mentioned the negotiations beginning on a plastic treaty. Plastic is an excellent opportunity for us to move away, to take this treaty negotiation process and figure out a way that for plastics we can move away from this terribly unsustainable and human rights harming system towards a circular economy that respects nature and respects people. So I'm excited about the prospects for that.
So one just quick thing, we'll have to probably bring to a close soon, is IFBES is currently working on its values line. So they're looking at an entire study, coming up with the multiple values of biodiversity. Have you engaged yet with this question of the relationship between human rights and multiple value systems, or will you engage with the IFBES process on this?
I'd be happy to engage with IFBES on this. I haven't done it to date, but I do think that, you know, when we talk about values, we have to talk about human rights and we have to talk about our total dependence on the natural world. And once we bring those things together, we get a sense that there's a better way that we can live our lives. And I think this is something that people really feel deep in their heart, that the way we're living today is fundamentally unsustainable, both from an ecological and a social perspective. And so when we talk about values, that's really what we're talking about. When we talk about the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, we're saying to each other, you matter, we all matter, but nature matters as well. And if we would have respect for nature and respect for each other, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in today.
That's great. I think it's a great way to wrap it up. Yeah. So, David, thank you very much for taking your time with us today. And really great to see your engagement in the convention. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you again in Kunming later on this year. Let's see how far we've gone. Great.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me, David. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And thanks for those of you who joined us online. Have a good day. Excellent, good start, thank you, that's great. Lovely, perfect. So yeah, we have to see Kunding, of course, and I imagine